I'll just be honest, like on some days I think about that puzzle and I think it would just be much easier if there were just nothing. Like it would be simpler if there were just nothing, because if there were nothing, then you don't have this problem of how there could be something that's not produced. It's like everything should be produced, but the blob of everything's unproduced. How is that even possible? And yet here we are, there's something. Yeah. And so now we have the puzzle to explain how there could be something and how there could be this blob of everything that's unproduced. It's not produced by anything beyond it.
Hey guys, thanks so much for taking the time to check out this segment from my interview with Dr. Josh Rasmussen on his new book, How Reason Can Lead to God. If you'd like to see the entire hour-and-a-half interview, including the bonus question I ask him at the end, please follow the link in the description to subscribestar.com/TUA. Subscribe for $5 a month. You'll get early access to the entire interview, including the bonus question where I ask him how the Trinity could possibly be tied into the necessary foundation of reality. Why is it necessary that there's 3 persons in the foundation? Why not 4? Why not 2? Subscribe for $5 a month. You'll get early access to that entire interview, and you'll help support the unapologetic apologists. Thanks, guys. So, well, you kind of just mentioned it there. So, right in the beginning, you open up a puzzle in what I thought was a unique way, because typically when we're talking about like the cosmological argument or stuff like this, we're just talking about the universe. But maybe if you could explain to the viewers how you conceptualize the blob of everything, as it were, so that even if we were thinking of something outside the universe, that would be included in what it is we're talking about.
Yeah, so I wanted to start with the kind of big picture of everything. And so I just let the word blob stand for whatever everything is, whether there is a God or not. Like, I'm making no assumptions. As long as there's something, then there is all of it or them. If it's a singular big blob, or ultimately we can understand it in terms of many particles or many things. And the reason why I wanted to start with this, and then we'll go into the puzzle, is because a lot of arguments that are based on cause and effect, and they're sort of seeking an ultimate cause of things, they'll have a play try to rule out an infinite regress. There's a lot of talk about infinite regresses, and there's this idea that you have to somehow show that there can't be an infinite regress in order to show that there's this kind of ultimate foundation of existence. And I wanted to show that you actually don't have to rule out an infinite regress. We can leave that to the side. The infinite regress gets complicated. It leads into territory that, I mean, it's not that we can't gain insight there, but it's that rather going into complex territory, let's see if we can get something very clear just using the law of non-contradiction, this basic principle of reason that there can't be contradictions. You can't have A and not A. And from there we can deduce that there's something uncaused, that there's something unproduced, that there's something ultimate and unexplained, just using the law of non-contradiction. And this was a discovery. I mean, it didn't occur to me for many, many years. I mean, it wasn't even until I was in graduate school that I remember just thinking like, wait a minute, like we don't even need to give these 5 premise arguments, like the universe had a beginning and therefore had a cause, and to get this kind of ultimate cause, or, you know, however many premises. All we need is the law of non-contradiction, together with the fact that there's something, to see that, well, it'd be a contradiction if beyond everything, there were something that produced that blob. Because if there's something beyond the blob of everything, then that blob of everything includes everything, so anything outside of everything is nothing. In which case there'd be something that's a nothing, and that's a contradiction. Since there can't be a something that's a nothing, it follows that the blob of everything has nothing beyond it that produced it. Now that's a little bit weird, because the things we ordinarily experience in life have something that produced them. Like, you know, the laptop that I'm speaking through, our technologies, they're produced by something. And so that leads to a puzzle, and I'll just be honest, like on some days I think about that puzzle and I think it would just be much easier if there were just nothing. Like, it would be simpler if there were just nothing, because if there were nothing, then you don't have this problem of how there could be something that's not produced. You know, it's like everything should be produced, but the blob of everything's unproduced. How is that even possible? And yet here we are, there's something. Yeah. And so now we have the puzzle to explain how there could be something, and how there could be this blob of everything that's unproduced. It's not produced by anything beyond it. So if it's produced, it's got to somehow be produced internally in some way. But how does that work? Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the puzzle. How could there be anything?
Yeah, and I think it's really unique because like a lot of, like you were saying, cause and effect and everything we know is produced, and that's even how a lot of these arguments for God works, is it's an uncaused first cause or an unmoved mover. And so we are going back, but we always get to like a first place and we say, okay, whatever this first moment in time was, there had to be a cause of that. And so we do kind of get stuck in this language.
Yes.
And so the way
And it may I'm sorry to cut you off here, but like many atheists will say, if you think that things have to be caused, what about God? And if you say God is uncaused, well, then why can't the universe be uncaused? Right? So there's almost a stalemate immediately. And I feel like in conversations with some atheists, there's a feeling of not being understood, I think, on behalf of the atheist feels like the theist is running along their argument to get to God, saying there's got to be this God, but then when you ask them, well, where did God come from? And if the theist says God is uncaused, then the atheist wants to come back and say, yeah, exactly. Something's uncaused. We agree with that. So why think it's God? Why not just the universe? And so that's a kind of an important point where I think theists and atheists can actually come to a common view and sort of realize, okay, there's got to be something uncaused. And I would say that's actually a point of progress, because I've also had conversations with atheists who've said, no, everything is caused in an infinite regress. And then I say, well, okay, what caused the infinite regress? Is that uncaused? Right? And if you say yes, in another infinite regress, okay, take the whole show, take all the infinite regresses together, call it the blob.
Yeah.
What caused that? Nothing. By the law of non-contradiction, there's nothing beyond it that could have caused it. So
yeah, and another reason it's helpful too is because sometimes, like if we're talking about an uncaused universe or an uncaused God, you can also get stuck in kind of a conversation. Well, maybe it's a quantum vacuum outside the universe, or something like this. Maybe these random particles that could produce a universe. So it is really helpful to just say, okay, everything we're going to conceive. If you want to say a multiverse, quantum vacuum, God, all of it. Let's talk about this, and then if it is self-produced in some way. So I don't want to answer it for you, but so I know your solution is what you're calling the foundation theory. So maybe if we could unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, so I mean, again, the puzzle is like, how can there be anything, right? How could there be anything? And it looks like when you think about it, the totality has to lack an outside cause. Well, how is that possible? How can any totality lack an outside cause? And one way to really feel the pain of it is to take something that has a cause. Let's just say a turtle. Okay, you just look at this turtle, it has a cause, and then imagine it being bigger. Would it thereby be able to be uncaused just by being bigger? It seems like different size wouldn't make that difference between being caused and uncaused. It could be as big as a house. That turtle could be as big as a planet. Could be as big as the entire universe. It could be shaped like the universe. In fact, it could have the constituents of the universe. And that thing would still seem to have to be caused, because the difference in size and shape and constituents don't seem to be relevant differences. So the question is, what would be a relevant difference between being caused and uncaused? And so the solution I propose is that there's got to be some foundational thing that exists in a robust way. Okay, its kind of existence, in a sense, allows it to be able to be uncaused. It's not like a turtle. So a turtle is a dependent kind of thing, and this foundational thing is an independent kind of thing. And then I go further to figure out, okay, well, what could allow this foundational thing to be independent? How can that be? And I propose that, it's got to be relevantly different from dependent things, and every dependent thing, by both reason and universal experience, have something in common. Namely, every dependent thing has the potential to have not existed at all. It's what we can call a contingent thing.
Yeah.
And so if we have an ultimate foundation for contingent things, then this foundation has to itself not be contingent, because that would be circular to have the contingent things are caused by a contingent thing. That's circular. That's like a chicken causing itself. And so there's got to be this different kind of thing, a foundational thing that's not contingent. And this really does solve the puzzle. And I want to say, like, many philosophers recognize this solution and have been, including philosophers who would still call themselves naturalists. They've been moved by this because it does solve this puzzle by anchoring contingent things in the kind of thing that's not contingent. It has a robust nature. It has a necessary nature. It exists and it cannot not exist. that's just the kind of thing that doesn't have to depend on something else. Because what can get sort of behind it to produce it? If it exists and it cannot not exist, it can't begin to exist, it can't cease to exist. There's nothing that can sort of get underneath it to produce it. So this is my solution to the puzzle. The puzzle is, again, how can there be anything? And in simple terms, my solution is there's got to be something that exists in a, you might say, self-existent sort of way, or a necessarily existent sort of way, foundational way.
Yeah.
So that's the idea.
So the atheist may say, that sounds suspiciously like God. Very sneaky of you. So just kind of thinking in kind of my devil's advocate kind of way, what if someone were to propose something like, well, what the relevant difference is the totality. And so suppose we assume a B theory of time, which I'm not an advocate for, but let's just say we would assume that. So there's this entire block of existence and of universe. Yeah. And so things inside the universe, like a computer, well, there's relative time and there's things outside of that computer, which would necessitate some outside cause for it. But if we're talking about just the B block of everything, the relevant difference is there is nothing outside of that. So could someone argue maybe that's just a brute fact? I know atheists like to go with the brute fact. So do you think they have something there?
So I think there is something there, but I think it doesn't solve the puzzle completely. Okay, it maybe answers a certain question, but it still leaves open this deeper puzzle. And let me try to draw this out. So imagine that there can be blocks that can just exist completely uncaused. Okay, now just for concreteness, let's say a blue cube. All right, and we could take the B theory, it could just be a space-time block. It could just exist completely uncaused, right? Okay, well, this seems to contradict our experience. So we don't have any experience of these blocks existing completely uncaused. Now, if they say, well, okay, the difference is you're talking about experience within the system versus experience of the total system, right? Okay, well, what do you mean when you say the total system? What's relevantly different between the big thing and the small thing? This is why I was using the example of a turtle, and I said, imagine if we changed the size and the shape of the turtle so that it was the size of the whole universe, okay? And in fact, maybe it even just was the whole universe. How does that difference in shape and size make the difference with respect to being able to exist uncaused? It doesn't seem like a mere difference in shape and size is going to make the difference. Now, what might be right about this idea that, well, the difference is that it's the totality and there's nothing outside the totality, okay? And I want to just say that's right, but we still haven't explained how there can be a totality without nothing outside of it. Maybe we could put the distinction this way. There's a difference between how you know there's something that's uncaused and how it could be uncaused. So we can know that it's uncaused because it's a totality. There's nothing outside of it. See what I mean? Mm-hmm. That's how you can know it. It's a contradiction for there to be something outside of everything. That's a contradiction. But that doesn't explain yet what kind of a reality could be uncaused. I mean, if you sort of think about conceptually possible realities, you sort of make up a reality in your mind. So like one reality has just a turtle and nothing else. Okay, you can conceive of that, but is that a real possibility? I mean, in one sense, it's maybe logically possible in the sense that there's not an internal contradiction in that. But in another sense, it violates this principle of irrelevant difference between a turtle on Earth and a turtle in this imaginary world is not relevant to account for how the turtle could be independent. And so what I'm looking for is an explanation of the difference between the dependent reality and the independent reality, and merely saying there's nothing outside of it doesn't explain the difference. That just points to the fact there needs to be a difference. Right. And so that would be part of my answer. But I mean, I do want to affirm that there is something right about the proposal. I mean, there is something right in saying there's nothing outside the totality. And I want to add one other thing here, because I was in a conversation with somebody who displayed a kind of intellectual humility and saying, who knows when we're starting to talk about like all of space and all of time, like who knows even could be caused. I mean, like maybe shoes and turtles, like those things can be caused, but space and time, like we don't even have experience with space being caused or with time being caused. And I actually was thinking later, it maybe be helpful for me to just say that like nothing in my argument even requires that there be a cause of space or time. I mean, at the end of the bridge that I lay out, I get to a supreme foundation, but I leave wide open theories of the nature of time and even the nature of space. I mean, so like Newton, for example, he is sort of famous for thinking of like space as being God's sensorium, where this is the realm where God experiences things, and you could think that space is actually in some way like part of the nature of God. You could think time is that way as well. And so there's actually no part of my argument that space or time have a beginning or have a cause. I leave that open, right? So for the sake of neutrality and inclusivity. And I want to just say that here because I think it's easier to see that differences in shape and size are just irrelevant to being foundational. And that's all we really need to get this puzzle off the ground, and to see that we need a special kind of foundation that's not different merely in shape and size.
Yeah.
So there's a lot there. I don't know if you want to clarify any of that, or
no, I'm just trying to think of where I want to go, because there's a couple chapters. I don't want to skip anything. At the same time, I know I can't get to anything. I really like the analogy of building a bridge that you have here. So our first beam, I think you kind of touched on it there, is independence. It has to be something that's independent. And you touched on necessity and ultimacy. And we may have already answered this question just now. It was just as you were saying it, I was recalling a debate you had. I can't remember who it was with. It was the guy who's an actor. He was he was kind of talking about, he's saying, if I could maybe accept a God if we just say God is a brute fact, but I don't understand why he has to be necessary. Like, what would that even mean to be necessary? And I know I'm going to come back to that later, kind of with the last question, but did we already answer that? Like, what it is about this kind of foundation theory that has to be necessary, not just a brute fact?
That was with Scott. Yeah, that was a really fun conversation, and in that conversation, I think one of his worries had to do with how a necessary foundation could really there was sort of a cluster of worries. So one worry was how that could actually explain contingent things. So how does this actually provide an explanation? And then kind of related is well, how does necessary existence explain it? So I think maybe his main point was there's got to be something that's brute, something that's unexplained. And the point of agreement. So I want either the necessary thing explains its own existence just by the fact that it cannot not exist. So its inability to not exist explains why it does exist rather than not. Or if you don't like that, then I'll just say that then it's brute. Okay, there's no further explanation. But then the question is, okay, well, if the necessary thing can be brute, then why can't the contingent things be brute? And my answer to that is because there's no difference between a contingent spider and a contingent blue cube and a contingent butterfly that is relevant to being able to be uncaused. These things are all relevantly alike, and the sort of the best explanation is going to be better than no explanation. And we have an available explanation here. Now, in the case of a necessary thing, I'm going to sort of let you decide if you think that its necessary nature explains its existence. But if you think it doesn't, then there's no possible further explanation. And if there's no possible further explanation, then that's a reason to not have a further explanation. But when it comes to contingent things, there is a further explanation available in terms of a necessary foundation. And the other thing just to add to this is that we can explain the contingent things by the activities of the necessary foundation. The necessary foundation, for example, could produce contingent things. And then those activities could be further explained in terms of what I want to say, non-necessitating reasons or aspects of its nature. So it's a non-deterministic explanation, which is familiar in our ordinary talk of explanations. We'll explain, that the forest fires, we can explain those in terms of various causes. These aren't logically entailing causes, but they do provide a kind of non-deterministic or non-entailing explanation. So I know there's a cluster of things there because I think he had a cluster of worries. But the key point is just that there is a difference between having a brute contingent thing and a necessary foundation. There's an important difference there. The necessary foundation provides that ultimate robust explanation of the rest of the world, whereas brute contingency, why multiply brute contingency beyond necessity? I mean, that's like, if you say that, then why not say that your thoughts are just contingent without any explanation, or why I think that Earth, it just popped into existence from nothing without any explanation. I mean, nobody was there. We have a theory that would explain it, right? Well, yeah, exactly. Because we have a theory that would explain it, that theory is going to be more probable than just nothing, right?
Yeah.
And so a necessary foundation provides a theory that explains the contingent things.
Yeah, I think something that's really important too, because I think Ed Fazer pointed this out, kind of in later in the book when you come to a foundation of reason and foundation of mind and things like that a brute fact not only, and this is according to Ed Fazer's definition, not only is something that we can't explain, but that's something that would, even in principle, wouldn't have an explanation. It couldn't have an explanation. You just get to just a brute foundation or something. But so if the brute foundation of reality is something that can't even in principle be explained, well then it's not coherent. It's not reasonable. It's not something that could be the foundation of reason. So at least with a necessary foundation, that necessity is the explanation, and so you do retain reason and it making sense.
Yeah. I mean, my own tendency is to think that even its necessity could be explained by its perfection. I mean, we'll look of uncovering other attributes through reason, but somebody wants to know what explains its necessity. Why is it necessary? Well, because anything that has a supreme perfect nature is going to be the kind of thing that can't fall apart. Like its supremacy is itself robust, and robust supremacy is something that a perfect thing would have. And so I would expect a perfect thing to have this necessary nature. So there's more if somebody wants more of an explanation. But yeah, no, that's a nice point. I like how you put that.
Yeah, thanks. And one thing I think happens too when you're talking to the skeptic or somebody who's an atheist is and I think rightfully so, they have a problem when you're describing God as something that's necessary, because I think they carry to the conversation all these assumptions about God. And especially if we're a Christian, there's a lot of assumptions about the Christian God. And it's like, okay, well, I can get if you're saying that there's this necessary thing as a foundation of reality, but why would this necessary thing be a Trinity? Or why would this necessary thing have to do with Jesus? Or why would this necessary thing have to do with all these Old Testament laws that we consider immoral? And so I think kind of that baggage is like, hey, you have a problem with saying that being is necessary? Like, what's going on here? I think that can sometimes be a problem for them. I do want to ask you, so coming to chapter 6, purely actual, and I think this was a really good point you made when you had your discussion with Tom Jump, which is why the foundation can't have arbitrary limits. Because he was saying, okay, let's say I do grant you that there's this cause of the universe. Why would we even say that cause has any more power than what's necessary to create the universe? Like, let's just say it has this exact amount of power to create the universe, because anything beyond that would just be speculation. But you made a really good point about whatever the necessary foundation is, it can't have arbitrary limits.
Yeah, well, I was even appealing to a principle of simplicity that's used in science. So, if we're thinking about, what's going to best explain our observation of gravity, for example. So you see, here's a hypothesis. Gravity holds between massive objects wherever we look. Okay, wherever we look. But it doesn't hold between massive objects outside of our observations. Okay, now, that theory, that hypothesis that gravity holds between massive objects wherever we look, it's empirically adequate. I mean, it explains all the data. It explains everywhere we look.
Right.
Okay? So, why posit this extra gravity beyond what we can see? Isn't that kind of like this ad hoc? I mean, that's just what people do. They posit their invisible deities, to fulfill that desire in their heart. And so why would we do that with gravity? Why not just say, who knows? We should just be intellectually humble here. Just leave it open. Maybe gravity works in other galaxies where we haven't explored those yet. But we shouldn't come down and say probably gravity works throughout the universe, right? So that's kind of a parallel kind of skepticism of gravity. And I think it's helpful to kind of make that parallel, because I think it makes more transparent, what's wrong with that. What's wrong with that is that the simplest hypothesis of our observations is that gravity works throughout the universe. That's actually a simpler hypothesis. It's not an arbitrarily limited hypothesis. And so I'm just using that same reasoning, applying it to the foundation of existence. This goes back to what we were talking about earlier about, am I a philosopher or am I a scientist of the foundations? I mean, I just want to use scientific reasoning common sense reasoning and apply it to all the different questions, including this question about the nature of the foundation of existence. And I want to say, look, I could be wrong, but other things being equal, let's shave off arbitrary limits. Let's look for the simplest theory first. This isn't the only argument, but this is one tool to help us kind of find the best explanation. And so yeah, I think that the best, at least initially, the best explanation or count of reality is going to be in terms of a simple hypothesis that shaves off arbitrary limits in the nature of the foundation. So I would think it's more likely than not that the foundation, its power is not arbitrarily limited, unless I get some other reason to think that it's got to be limited, right? Mm-hmm. And this came up with my conversation with Graham Oppy as well. I mean, he said kind of a similar thing, that, let's leave that open. And it actually occurred to me afterwards, because I tend to sort of continue to process and ponder these conversations and learn from them. And it occurred to me after the conversation. I remember I was like jogging around my block. I like remember where I was. I'm like pondering this conversation with Graham Oppy, and it occurred to me that he's right, that if you leave it open, then you're less likely to be wrong, because you haven't taken the risk of having a belief about it. Okay, so like if you leave it open, like if you just say, same with gravity. Let's go back to the gravity example. If I leave open whether gravity works outside my room right now, I'm not looking outside my room. I could leave that open. I am less likely to be wrong because I haven't formed a belief. Okay, but I'm also less likely to be right as well, right? And that's the thing to keep in mind. I mean, I think it's more probable that gravity is working outside my room. And if I don't have a belief about that, I'm less likely to be wrong, but I'm also less likely to be right. And I think that's important, especially if you want not just to avoid false beliefs, but you want to have true beliefs, right? And there's a little bit of risk in that, because you're trying to build your view based on the data you have, and you could be wrong, but that's how science works, right? You come up with a hypothesis, you figure out what's the best explanation. We can revise our beliefs. That's fine. That's fair. So that's why I want to remove the arbitrary limits as far as I can.
And it does
my reasons.
Aid you in like further philosophical or theological inquiries. Like one of the things I know atheists like to say is, well, if we're going to give them any kind of evidence for God, it has to be able to make future testable predictions. And so, for example, like you said with gravity, if we assume gravity also works in all these other places that we haven't observed, you can make future testable predictions that are likely to be correct on that. And the same with God. When you get into complicated theories like Molinism, well, God could God have created a more complex universe? Or could God take all this into account? Could he have infinite knowledge? You can actually make predictions on those kinds of things if you take the assumption that he's infinite in his knowledge instead of placing an arbitrary limit on that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's easy to get future testable predictions on theism. One of the responses could be that, well, there are other hypotheses that can explain the data, and that's fair. But then that's why we're looking for a simplest hypothesis, other things being equal. I mean, just for example, on theism, there's a perfect being that's going to predict that it's going to have the combination of perfect attributes like knowledge, power, and goodness, and in a perfect way, right? And so that's going to imply, or at least make very probable, that there's going to continue to be a kind of moral landscape. Principles of reason and logic are going to continue to exist because these are the framework for perfect thinking. And that this is in the future. I mean, we can test this, we can check in a minute and see if the principles of reason still exist and if the moral landscape still exists, if you still have a sense of morality, if you still exist, we can check that. And, theism makes that prediction, right? And this isn't again to say that there aren't other hypotheses that make that prediction, and so we got to look at the different hypotheses. But it's just to say, I think sometimes there's this kind of idea that like if you're talking about theology, you can't test it. Like there's no predictions that can be made. You can't treat it scientifically. It's like no, you can use the same structure of scientific reasoning, where you compare hypotheses, compare theoretical virtues, explanatory scope, simplicity, successful predictions, and et cetera. So that's my main point here, is that there is a kind of scientific approach that you can apply, and it's helpful.
Yeah.